The next thing that we need to consider when it comes to enterprise deployment is activation. We've got to activate the machines. Every edition of Windows 10, even the enterprise and the education versions, are going to require activation. Of course, this is not unique to mass deployments and automated installations in an enterprise. If you install a retail version of Windows 10, it's going to require activation, but in that case, it's just a one-to-one connection. You've typed in a product key, you activate the product, and you're done. A little bit more to it than that in the enterprise. Now, in the past, when you used volume license media, which is typical for enterprise education, if you've got a software assurance agreement with Microsoft, you didn't have a product, or you didn't have any activation, excuse me. You had a product key. It was a product key that was the same for all of your installations, and those devices didn't require activation. Well, I think some point along the way, Microsoft probably figured that that wasn't a great idea, because you were trusting organizations and all of their employees, to not duplicate that media. And I know for certain, having dealt with volume license media, that it got duplicated quite frequently because it didn't require any activation. You could continue to use it. So they changed it around, and now every edition requires activation. There's basically three types of product keys, or three types of activation methods. There's the retail method, the OEM method, and then the volume licensing method. When you get a product DVD with a retail key, you activate it once, and when you activate it once, that product key can now not be used to activate anything else. And the reason is because it associates that product key, and it goes out and talks to Microsoft over the internet. It associates that product key with your installation ID, and your installation ID is a unique ID on that system that you've installed it on. It's possible to reuse a retail product key, but you'd have to call Microsoft, and you'd call them and say, something like, well, the PC that I had died, it blew up, and so I had to go buy more hardware, or I built this other custom PC and now I want to transfer it. And that usually will fly one time. You try doing that 2 or 3 times, you're going to probably have a little bit more of a problem. OEM, they get their own special keys. Those systems are activated. I just purchased a laptop 6 months ago or so. It didn't have Windows 10 on it then, but I put it on pretty quickly. But the point is, when you got it, you open it up, you go through a little mini setup and customization, but it's already activated. It's already been configured for you. Or if it's not activated, you just go through the activation. You don't actually have to type in a product key. Okay? And so that's OEM activation. Volume license is if you've got a software assurance agreement. Now, if you want to see the status of your activation, you can use the Software License Manager tool, SLMGR. If you just type that into a command prompt, it'll bring up various options. The ATO option is the one that will activate. IPK for input product key. We're not going to look at this, but you can just be familiar with the name of that utility. So volume activation technologies are going to be used in enterprise deployment scenarios, and they're going to simplify and secure an enhanced method of activation. Volume Activation Services is a server role in Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, and it provides essentially 2 different kinds of activation. The first is KMS, or Key Management Service. In this case, clients are activated without accessing Microsoft directly. Instead, they access an internal KMS server, and that will do the activation. However, the activation isn't actually triggered unless you've got at least 25 computers to activate at one time. And so that is targeted towards those types of environments. That's not a very large environment, but you'd have to at least be deploying that number. Active Directory activation is a role that allows AD-joined systems to store activation objects in Active Directory. This will work for anything that's Windows 8 and later, which of course includes Windows 10, and it has to be a domain-joined system. So the domain-joined system would be installed using a generic volume license key that's the same for that particular media and anybody using it, but then it would communicate and automatically activate as soon as it was joined to the domain. The third type is MAK, which stands for Multiple Activation Key. And that type of activation uses product keys that may be activated a specific number of times. So let's start with KMS activation. We'll walk through how it works. This is something we just, you want to be familiar with because a lot of times people think activation and they just think, okay, yeah, we're just going into Windows and clicking activate. And there are significantly different processes that happen in the enterprise. So the way it works is a KMS host is installed and activated. This is a Windows server. It's then going to publish its information in DNS in the form of service records. Those are those SRV or service locator records that point to the machine that's providing the service. So clients will use those service records to locate the KMS server. They'll contact that server using anonymous connection on TCP port 1688. Okay. At that point, the KMS server will return the activation count. In other words, how many computers have communicated with it thus far. The client then will evaluate, and if the threshold of 25 has been met, the client will then activate. Unactivated computers will contact KMS every 2 hours until they can be activated. And the activation then is not a permanent thing. Okay? They will continue to essentially refresh their activation every 7 days, and they have to contact the KMS server within 180 days to remain activated. Okay? So it's an ongoing thing that ensures that the systems stay within the organization. Okay? If they go outside of the organization, I mean, technically you have half a year, but still, if you go outside of the organization, eventually that activation is going to go away. Okay, so for systems that are internal, KMS activation works in that way. Active Directory activation, on the other hand, works a little bit different. First off, you have to extend the Active Directory Domain Services schema. The schema is kind of the backbone in Active Directory. It has the definitions of all the objects that I could create, like users, groups, computers, etc. And so that has to be extended to be able to store these activation objects or attributes. That's done as soon as you install a Windows Server 2012 domain controller. There's no special, program that you have to run to extend the schema. So as long as you've got domain controllers running 2012 or 2012 R2, then this will already be done. Then I go and install the Volume Activation Services role, and I set up a KMS host. Okay, computers will then activate when they join the domain. This started with Windows 8, so it's Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2. It's nothing prior to Windows 8. These are machines that are installed with a generic volume license key and then activate when they join the domain, and the activation is valid for 180 days. The difference between this and KMS, it's pretty similar. The difference is you have to join to the domain. If you're removed from the domain, they will be unactivated. Okay? And then the other difference is there is no threshold, so it doesn't have to be 25 machines or anything like that. If AD activation is not available, then it'll attempt KMS activation as a fallback. Okay, and so those two definitely go together. The multiple activation key, I didn't really say much more about that, so just to kind of summarize that, it literally is you're dealing with volume license type of media. You've got a software assurance agreement, but basically you're still just doing a manual activation on each system. It's that you can use the same key across multiple systems. The number of systems is dependent on your license agreement. There is a volume activation management tool, VAMT, that's a part of the Windows ADK that will allow you to centrally manage and just kind of keep track of all of those activations. And so that one is more of a manual. AD activation and KMS, it's really an automated process, and that facilitates enterprise deployment because you don't have to then worry about the additional activation. You can get it happening automatically. And so that's why it fits in to this kind of section where we've been dealing with the deployment of Windows 10 within the enterprise.